Thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate you taking the time to sit down with Outstanding Screenplays.
My pleasure. Happy to be here.
Thank you. We're going to be doing quite a deep dive with you in general about what screenwriters can do to be writing a very compelling story. So I'd love to know, have your thoughts on all of that. But first of all, at the top, I'd like to ask you, what drew you to the film industry? How did you know it was for you? Was it something you always envisioned from childhood, or did you sort of fall into it? I really want to know your thoughts on that.
You know, I was one of those kids that was absolutely obsessed with show business. And that included movies, that included TV series, that included live theater. I always wanted to know what was going on backstage or behind the scenes. And if there was ever a special about how a movie was made, I would watch that. And when things like Entertainment Tonight would come on and would show you behind the scenes things, boy, I was just obsessed. Anytime I could read a story or an article about how something came together, all that stuff was always fascinated to me. I wanted to know, how the sausage was made, if you will. So I kind of knew from a young age I wanted to do something in entertainment. I didn't know what. Initially, I thought I would work in the theater because that felt more immediate. I sort of understood that because I could see it on stage, so it felt tangible. I wanted to be an actor for a while. Fortunately, while I was still in college, I went to NYU. And while I was still at NYU, I sort of decided maybe I didn't want to be an actor. But while at NYU, the fall of my senior year, I produced and directed an original show. And I did it because I thought it would be fun. But it turned out to be not only fun, but it ended up being very successful. The audiences really liked it. It was a hit. All our performances sold out. And I felt like, I really enjoy putting all the pieces together. So for a while, I thought, I'm going to try to produce theater. So when I got out of school, I got jobs in the New York theater world as a production assistant, a producer's assistant. I worked for a Broadway advertising agency for a couple of years, and I learned a lot. But one of the things that I learned was that in the theater, you really needed to have the ability to raise millions and millions of dollars. Now, I was in my very early 20s. I didn't come from a rich family. I didn't have rich friends. So I couldn't figure out how that would ever work for me, especially at that point in my very young life. And my best friend had what's called a development job in television. And I learned a little bit about what that was. And I thought, I could do that. I like the idea of working with writers and finding material. And that seemed exciting to me. So I found a job in New York working for a film producer named Aaron Russo. There are very few development jobs in New York. Most of them are really book scouts. So Aaron Russo, I don't think he ever read a book. So that was not part of the agenda, was finding books. But I went to work for him. He made me his development executive very quickly. And I worked for him for about 3 years. He eventually moved me to LA. And then soon afterwards, I went to work for another better film producer named Martin Bregman. And Marty had he had a deal with Universal, but he had some financing, which was hugely beneficial to me because he had money, he was considered a buyer. So I was able to, as his representative, increase my relationships with various agents. And a lot of the people to this day that I still know and deal with are people who I got to know during the time I worked for him. While I was there, I produced and directed my first feature film, a movie for Touchstone Pictures called Nothing to Lose with Martin Lawrence and Tim Robbins. I left the company before it was made. So another movie that he made called The Bone Collector with Denzel Washington and Angelina Jolie, I was sort of demoted to executive producer, but I still got executive producer because it was a book that I found and set up and developed. I'm very proud of. But when I left there, I went out on my own with a producing partner, a gentleman named Bruce Cohen. And I asked him to be my producing partner because we complemented each other very well. My background was much more on the creative end of things, especially working with writers and agents and such. And his background was much more physical production. He had been sort of an on-set producer for Amblin. And we started our partnership, and no matter how hard you work, no matter how good you are at what you do, I don't believe that anybody is successful without some luck. And the huge piece of luck I got was I was one of maybe a dozen producers who were given an early look at a screenplay called American Beauty. And I got that from an agent named Andrew Canava at UTA. I got it because I was familiar with Alan Ball's theater work, again, being a big theater geek. And I brought it to DreamWorks. DreamWorks liked it, and they bought it or optioned it for us. And we were on our road to making that movie. And American Beauty really gave me a career. I owe so much to that movie. It was the hardest I ever worked, but I still am appreciative of how lucky I was to come across a screenplay that was that good. And that's really what started my career.
Just that, I mean, that's incredible. It sounds like you just had, it sounds to me like an innate calling from a really young age. You just knew, and then you put yourself in the arena. It's incredible.
Well, I always knew I wanted to do something in entertainment, but jumping ahead, people who know that American Beauty won the Oscar know I won an Oscar. That was never, I never thought that was a possibility. If anything, when I was growing up, I would think, gee, if I ever won a Tony Award, because I'm such a theater guy. But I was always obsessed with movies, but I couldn't figure out how to connect those dots, how that could ever happen. And even when I started working in the movie business in New York, it still felt like, oh, but the real movies are made in LA. Even movies that are shot in New York are usually put together in LA. So I felt like I had to jump over several hurdles to sort of figure out how to actually get into the movie business. And then it was maybe about 5 or 6 years after we started our company, we started also doing television. And I'm really, really happy. I love now doing both movies and TV. And what's interesting is now virtually every movie producer is also a TV producer. It's the same writers, it's the same actors, it's the same directors. You kind of have to do both, I think.
Which I'd love to touch on that subject. I'm going to first ask you, because you did mention that the Bone Collector, you said you read it as a book first. What was it about that book when you came across it that you thought this could make a great film?
Well, mostly the lead character was such a fantastic character in the book. The writer was a guy named Jeffrey Deaver, a very, very talented writer. And I thought this is a role that an actor could win an Oscar for. Interestingly enough, my then boss, Martin Bregman, had this long relationship with Al Pacino. So when I first read it, I sort of thought, oh, I wonder if this could be an Al Pacino part. It ended up being Denzel Washington, one of the greatest stars on the planet. But I can't take any credit for that. My role in there was finding it. I helped hire the writer, and I spent a lot of time developing that screenplay. But then I left to start my own company as that was being put together again, which is why I was only executive producer, not full producer.
Okay. And you've spoken on American Beauty there. I just have to ask you, because it's such an incredible film. When you first read the script, did you have did you envision it being as big a success as it was going to be? And if you did, what were the indicators in the script, in the original screenplay that you read?
I can honestly say that not one person, including Alan Ball, who wrote American Beauty, nobody pictured the success that it was going to have. I will tell you, it was at that time, and I would say still to this day, the best screenplay I ever read. I think Alan Ball is a ridiculously talented writer. You know, it's interesting, when most movies achieve some kind of success, the credit will all go to the director. And in the case of American Beauty, something that was very important to me that I think that we achieved is that the credit went to both the writer, Alan Ball, and the director, Sam Mendes, and they both equally deserve it. And I will tell you, in a business where the word genius, I feel like, is an overused term. I don't think there are that many real geniuses. I felt very fortunate that I was able to work with two geniuses in Alan Ball and Sam Mendes on that one movie. They were both just doing great work. It was Alan's first screenplay. It was Sam's first movie, but it was a great marriage. We all got along very, very well together. Again, it was an incredibly hard movie to get made, mostly for financial reasons. DreamWorks was very supportive, but there were, on the whole, a number of people who just didn't believe the movie was going to do any business at all. They thought we were making a tiny little, there were some people at DreamWorks who thought we were making a tiny little art. Fortunately, we had a great champion in Steven Spielberg. And when we needed more time, because going into it, we sort of knew that we had a schedule that was unmakeable, it was Spielberg who came through and gave us some additional shooting days, which the movie wouldn't have been the movie without that. We didn't waste any time on it. It was a more complicated movie than it probably looked, because those houses didn't really exist. There were interiors in one part of town and interiors the other house, another part of town, and then exteriors on the Warner lot. But then we had to do some interiors on the Warner lot because of the communication between the houses, and it was just a complicated movie to shoot. And we were going for not good performances, but great performances, and sometimes that all takes time. And also, it's a beautifully shot movie, and we had one of the great directors of photography of all time, the late great Conrad Hall, who was, I think, 72 years old, which means he wasn't fast. And we saw early on, oh, he takes his time lighting this. It looks spectacular when it's lit, but nobody wanted to replace him. He won an Oscar for doing it, but that also added some time to our schedule because, it looks wonderful, and we thought it was worth taking the time to have it look that way.
And you spoke on the challenges of getting a film like that to production. Will a good screenplay always salvage things like that? More time? Is it always in the page first, or are there many, as you said, there's many moving parts, there's many departments, many things have to fall into place to get a film that's level of success? But do you think that it will essentially always come down to how good the screenplay is in the beginning? Will that always salvage that? Cannot that always win over an argument, or are there other things at play?
Sophie, I love that you asked that question. That's a great question, because usually it won't, but something fascinating happened in the case of American Beauty. It became after it was sold, usually in LA, if a spec screenplay goes out, people are reading it when it's available, but then once somebody buys it, why do I want to read that? Somebody else already bought it. That wasn't what happened with American Beauty. It was a screenplay that took on a life of its own. People would talk about it at dinner parties. It would come up in meetings. Have you read the script? It's so good. And I had people calling me all the time saying, wow, how did you get a hold of the script? And and good for you for getting it. And people were just so excited about this piece of material. Well, DreamWorks knew that. And, whether he was just the messenger or not, but the guy that ran physical production at DreamWorks at the time was the one who was really coming down hardest on us about the budget, and at times was almost inappropriate in terms of things that he said about the movie and the commercial viability of the movie while we were shooting it, threatening to shut us down, threatening to fire us. It was some rough going behind the scenes. We tried to keep that away from the set as much as we possibly could, but me and my producing partner really had to deal with a lot. But the fact that American Beauty was such a beloved script that DreamWorks knew they didn't want to be the studio that screwed it up, because they were aware that it had become so beloved. That said, there is one sequence that we did cut for budget reasons. And I'll tell you, I know there are some directors that feel threatened by having the writer around. And not only did we promise Alan Ball, the writer, that he would be welcome on set every day, but we would not hire a director who didn't feel the same way. Fortunately, Sam Mendes came from the theater, and in the theater, the playwright is always there. They contractually are allowed to be there whenever they want. So Sam was excited about the idea of Alan being there. Because Alan was there every single day, he was, and we sat together all day, every day, and we shot very long days. So we spent a lot of time together. So Alan became much, much more aware than most writers would of the budget issues, because he was literally sitting there with us. And he saw what we knew was that we had a sequence that was just going to be out of our budget range. And the studio wanted us to just cut that completely, which we could have. But Alan said, I know we can't afford this sequence, but there's an important emotional element to that sequence. And he came up with something that would be very simple to shoot, but still emotionally evocative in the same way, that really adds to the movie. And that wouldn't have happened if our writer wasn't there in the trenches with us and being a real partner to us. For people who know the movie, it's a scene where the character of Ricky and Jane, Thora Birch and Wes Bentley, are walking down a tree-lined street, and a funeral brigade goes by them. And it's a very simple scene, not an expensive thing to shoot, but it leaves you with something, especially the dialogue during that scene. As originally written, it was a scene on a highway involving hundreds of cars and a big accident. So for us, it would have involved a lot of renting all those cars, all those extras, shutting down a freeway. It was just a very expensive budgetary item on our very small budget.
So it's incredibly important for a writer to have the ability to come up with quick problem-solving, creative ways to potentially get the same message across in that scene without the budget being through the roof.
There are other examples. We have a better movie because Alan Ball was there with us every single day.
I want to speak generally now on what you, besides American Beauty, generally what you look for in a screenplay, where you think what qualities is it that gives it that sense of this is going to be a great film and this is going to be film worthy, as it were, and worth pursuing? Are there certain qualities now that you look for?
There are qualities that I look for. I read an enormous number of screenplays, so this is going to sound very generic, but good writing stands out. If you read 10 or 12 scripts over a weekend, and 11 of them are just okay, and one of them has characters that are interesting and evocative and surprising, where you don't know exactly where things are going to go, automatically I get more excited reading. I read it faster. I read it. I don't want to get up and go to the bathroom. I just want to sit there and hold that script in my hand. So sometimes it's hard to define, but what's less interesting to me is something that feels so formulaic, where on page 10 exactly where you're going to be on page 110. And if something follows a formula that exact, I get bored. I thought, where's this writer's voice? What are they adding to it? There's been a trend the last several years of a lot of the blacklist scripts will be like the making of whatever, and it'll show you the real story about how such and such was made. Some of these are phenomenal movies, but boy, some of these scripts just feel so cookie cutter. And I know the writers aren't reading as many scripts as I am, but I wish they were. I think they would realize, just because I had the idea to tell you the story of, I'm making this up, I've not read this, but like the behind the scenes story of the Slinky, that's not enough. It's executing these with some kind of a voice, with some kind of a finesse, with something that makes the reader go, oh, I didn't see that coming. That's what makes it different to me.
I'd love to get your thoughts on, a lot of this is said to new screenwriters, this concept of overwriting, and also especially on where do you sit with dialogue. Sometimes I think new screenwriters can tend to Well, there's a sort of general idea that maybe don't overwrite, and also keeping dialogue to a minimum. What's your thoughts on that? Do you think, and what's your take on what overwriting means in general? This is just a sort of question for new screenwriters trying to find their voice.
You know, to me, overwriting is if I read something on page 27 and I realize, you know, you just said the exact same thing on page 16. Why are you telling me this information again? That to me is overwriting. Sometimes a scene, if there's a scene that should be 3 pages and it's 5 pages, that's overwriting. That said, I'm not saying a 5-page scene is bad. I'm saying because sometimes 5 pages is exactly what you need to tell the story well. Because so it's a case by case basis. You take as much time as you need, but you also have to be very sensitive. The last thing you want to do is bore the reader. If you bore the reader, you're going to bore the audience.
And are there specific questions a screenwriter should be sitting down to ask themselves? How can I make this more compelling? Are there certain questions you can ask yourself when you sit down to write to make sure your story is going to be compelling?
Well, the first thing you want to do is figure out how you're going to grab the reader in that first 10, 15, 20 pages. Because especially if you're a newer writer, then to get somebody to read your script is already a challenge. If you haven't figured out a way to grab them, they may not keep reading. So it's understanding what your audience is. Your first audience is going to be probably somebody who reads a lot of scripts. So what is it about your script that's going to have them do that thing I talked about earlier, where you kind of sit up and go, oh, this just surprised me. This character just did this thing that was so interesting. This element just kind of grabbed me. This is a TV example, but we were talking about Alan Ball. Alan Ball, right after American Beauty, did a TV series called 6 Feet Under, which was, if you haven't seen the pilot of 6 Feet Under, go watch it, because the way he introduces all of those characters is so fascinating. But one of the elements, and I haven't seen this for a while, but Peter Krause meets Rachel Griffiths on a plane. They get off the plane and they have sex in like a broom closet at the airport. These are two people who are never going to see each other again. Peter Krause goes to his home, this funeral parlor. He finds out his dad has died. He's a wreck. He doesn't know who to call, who to talk to. The only person he could think of to call is this woman he had sex with in a broom closet. Immediately you're like, oh my God, he's calling this woman who he had a quick fling with. What's that going to be about? How's that relationship going to work? And the first time I think I read it before I saw it, but I was like, fuck, I want to know more immediately. It's audiences, we want to be taken out of our world and we want to be taken into the world of other people. We want to be interested, excited, moved in whatever way that is, whether it's humor or drama or romance, but we want to escape from our own world in some way or other. And be involved in the world of the characters you're created. So whatever way you as a writer can do that, that's gold. That's what we people like me all look for.
And do you have, within those famous first 10 pages, do you have any particular turn-offs that just make you want to put it down? Well, are there some obvious mistakes?
As I was saying earlier, if something feels completely formulaic from page 1, you're like, oh, this feels like 12 other scripts I read, except for you've substituted this for that. That's a turnoff for me. If it doesn't feel like there's any originality, there's no voice, there's nothing about it. They have nothing new to say. I feel like it's hard to figure out this business. It's hard to figure out what people are looking for. And I think that sometimes, I don't even want to say writers, because all of us do it. Certainly producers can do this as well. But we find ourselves trying to figure out what that magic thing is that Netflix or Amazon or Hulu or HBO, we try to figure out what they're looking for. I think that is usually a fool's errand. I think that when you try to figure out what somebody else wants, it's usually, you know what they want? They want a hit. They want something that's really good. They want something that's going to bring them more subscribers, or if it's a movie, it's going to bring in big box office. That's what they ultimately want. If you look at a TV series like Baby Reindeer, that went against every single rule. They don't want limited series. That's a limited series. They want people who, they want stars. We didn't know who any of those people were. They want things based on big IP. That was a completely wildly original story. Yet it became, the biggest show anywhere for a while. I mean, I love stories like that. But the moral of that story is write what you love and feel passionate about. That said, be aware of certain truisms. Right now, we're at a moment where period stuff is harder. Almost everybody will tell you they don't want period. But that said, almost all of them still buy period. They don't buy it in bulk. They buy it very selectively. There has to be something about it that they're like, all right, I know we said we're not going to buy period, but let's go ahead and buy Bridgerton for X, Y, and Z, or The Great for X, Y, and Z. They all end up doing period. It's just be aware that that's a harder sell.
I was going to ask you how aware should writers be then of what is currently on trend? But you've just spoken on that. But should you be looking to sort of have that in your mind as if you're sitting down to write something brand new, or should you sort of, if you had to go head or heart, which one would you back?
So this is a moment where certainly things based on giant IP can have an advantage. Most new writers don't have access to giant IP. So what they have going for them is their brain, their originality, their creativity. So I would suggest going for ideas that are wildly original. It's better that you fail with something wildly original that you love than try to do something that's going to feel like a retread of 8 of the shows that are on the air.
And I suppose, when you're reading, do you feel that the amount of love that's gone into it and the amount of formulaic construction that's gone into it?
I'll do the positive. I can feel when there's a really original voice, when there's somebody who's saying something on like I talked earlier about when I first read that screenplay of American Beauty. I never had any idea what was going to happen on the next page. Alan Balt just kept surprising me throughout that whole journey.
And with a protagonist, is there something you look for from a protagonist in particular? Certain qualities that get you on board with that character? What is it is it their choices? Is it their overall arc throughout the film? What are the specific things that grab you when you're reading it, that you think this is going to be?
I think a good writer needs to figure out a way so that we're on the character's journey. The wrong way to read that would be make sure they're likable. One of my favorite protagonists from television of the last 30 years is Tony Soprano. Tony Soprano was a gangster. He was a womanizer. He had all these awful qualities, but we also saw somebody who was struggling to be a good father, struggling to be a good husband. And then he had this bizarre relationship with his mom who was so mean to him that immediately we're like, oh my God, I want to know more about this guy. And then we saw that all of this was bothering him so much that he had to start going to therapists, and then we're like, wait, this guy is going to a therapist? I wanted to know more immediately. Boy, did that pilot pull me in. And by all rights, it shouldn't have. Why should I care about this gangster from New Jersey? But I cared tremendously. That's a great example because it's one of our TV's great characters, but it shows how you can care about someone who on paper you shouldn't really care about. That's the job of a writer. What choices does that person make, and what else is going on in their world that's going to make me really interested and intrigued and fascinated by their journey?
And with an unlikable protagonist, which is becoming a lot more popular. Do you think there has to be redeeming qualities for the audience to be on board?
Well, see, redeeming is a different word. Like, again, I'm going to talk about Tony Soprano again for a second. I don't know that he had as many. Well, he had some redeeming qualities. As I said, you could see the struggle to be a good father and a good husband. But I think that the more we understood his situation, the more we were sort of engaged. So it's you know, the famous book Save the Cat, figuring out what that thing is going to be that's going to make us still care about this person with everything else that's going on.
I want to talk to you a bit on how much writers should adapt their work based on feedback.
Well, it's an interesting question. How should writers adapt their work based on feedback? You know, I think that writers have their own business. And as long as they're working on something for themselves, if they've sold a project to a studio or a network, then you've taken on business partners. And part of your job is to, at least doesn't mean you need to do everything that somebody tells you, but you at least need to listen and consider. When you're writing it yourself, I think any writer is crazy if they don't surround themselves with smart friends who will give them honest opinions, because virtually no writer writes a first draft that's great. That's just that is such a rarity. There's an old expression: writers don't write, they rewrite. And it's hopefully you'll have either a producer that you're working with very closely, whose feedback you respect and whose notes can make something better, or good writer friends who you share material with, and you give them good feedback on their script and they give you good feedback on your script. Again, that doesn't mean do everything that you're told, because that can often lead to an awful script, but it means listen to somebody and learn how to take a note. Sometimes, I'm not the first one to say this, obviously, but sometimes somebody will say, gee, I had a real problem with the third act. Why don't you try doing X, Y, or Z? Well, their suggestion might stink, but the headline is, okay, something's not working in the third act. I don't like this idea, but let me go back and try to figure out. And sometimes it's not even a third act thing. Sometimes the third act thing can be a first act thing, but something isn't working. Let me try to get to the heart of what's not working.
And it's obviously really important to develop that relationship, the producer and the writer. What are the qualities you look for in a writer where you know it's going to be a good working relationship versus the qualities that you look out for that you know, I can't work with this person?
Well, I love working with writers. That's my favorite part of my job is working with a writer. And I always feel like it's my job to try to figure out what the writer's intention was, because sometimes a writer, you can see that a writer's intending one thing, but they'll write in a direction that's not always honoring their own intentions. So I will usually ask a lot of questions. I don't want or expect a writer to do all of my notes, but I do want a writer to consider all of my notes, to give real thought. And if they say, you know, this note I really agree with, this note I'm not so sure about, let me try something else though in that spot, that's great. What I don't need is for my note to be done exactly. I just want the script to be great. And whatever the best route to get there is what's most important. If I have there's a writer who's, you know, done a lot of stuff that had some real success, and I was working with them on something, or started to work with them on something, and we did a few outlines, and not only wouldn't they work on it between our meetings at all, but I felt like every note I was giving, they were arguing with. And I thought about it and I said, you know, hey, why don't you go take this and bring this to somebody else? Because I don't feel like and the writer was very, very taken aback. What do you mean? How are you saying that? Maybe I was being too sensitive. I said, you know, maybe, but let's find something else to work on, because it feels like we're just not in the same place with this. My hope is that the learned something from that, and maybe next time wasn't being quite so precious. But if I feel like my notes are going in one ear and out the other, then we're probably not a good pairing to work together.
And how much does the screenplay evolve from the original one you read, to production?
That's a very good question, and that all depends on the script. If I had my druthers, I would read a script that was perfect and not have. What I do not need at all is to put my fingerprints on something. I don't have any piece of that. And I would say the best movie I made is American Beauty, and I think that my greatest job on that was protecting the script. I think I stopped some bad notes from being implemented. There were certainly some big trims that were made, and certainly a few changes, but an awful lot of American Beauty is exactly the screenplay that Alan Ball first wrote. The biggest changes were at the beginning and the end, were things that were removed, but everything that's there now was always there. So I don't need to change things. But again, that was the best script I ever read, and most scripts do need some kind of shaping. I did the next movie after American Beauty was a very different movie called Down with Love. It was sort of an homage to Rock Hudson, Doris Day sex comedies, starring Ewan McGregor and Renee Zellweger, and that script was hilarious from day one. And it was making all these very important points about women in the workplace and the women's movement and sexism and all of that. But there were all these sort of other things that were put in there as well. Like the writers wanted to make 12 other political statements. And I think a lot of what I did was, I think what's there was always there, but I said, let's do this really, really well and not try to also add on all these other things, because I felt like it was sort of too much. And so the bigger picture was kind of hard to take in. Again, 100% of the credit goes to those writers who are just delightful writers, Eve Allert and Dennis Drake. But I think my greatest role in that was just kind of taking away some little elements that I thought were not helping their main story, the overall theme of the movie.
In terms of a writer having something to say, how would you say they effectively do that without coming across as dogmatic or preachy within the screenplay?
That all depends on the movie. There's an old saying: if you want to send a message, call Western Union. That none of us want to see a movie that feels like a message picture. That said, isn't it great when you can watch something and really get a message out of it? When a movie, I love being affected by a movie. When a movie can affect you in some way emotionally or change your perspective on something, that's gold. But first and foremost, it has to be entertaining. It has to tell the story it's telling really well. I think a message should be, if you're going to have a message, it needs to be subtle. Don't hit an audience over the head with it, or you're not gonna have much of an audience. I just don't think audiences want to be given a message. Again, doesn't mean we shouldn't have one, because some of my favorite movies do, but usually they're sort of feathered in a way that feels organic and subtle.
Was there a screenplay you read recently that's really stuck with you, and could you say why that has been? What is it recently, one that you've read?
I read so many screenplays that I'm trying to think of one that I've read recently. There's a screenplay that I'm working on right now that I really like a lot. It's a thriller that's sort of harkens back to a movie like A Fatal Attraction. And it's one of those that, again, it kept surprising me. I think the writer created a wonderful female protagonist that I was excited about and intrigued by, and it's kind of the movie that's been sticking with me a lot. We've been working on it a bunch lately, and I enjoy every time I sit down to read a new draft of it.
I want to speak a bit on genres. Are there particular genres at the moment that you think audiences are craving for, and how much should a writer bear that in mind?
You know, I'm not saying anything that other people don't know. That certain things in terms of movie theaters, people more than ever need a reason to leave their house to go to a movie, and it's that audience experience that they're craving. So, you know, certainly horror films are very much in vogue. That said, a lot of writers know that. A lot of writers are writing horror films. Only a few of them really make the grade. But every year, there are a handful of horror films that are made for a budget that end up making a tremendous amount of money. So that's a genre that's not going away. But again, some of them are really good and some of them are not. You know, certainly giant event films are that give you a huge cinematic experience. Those are going to continue to get made. Outside of those categories, it's harder to get movies made for theaters now. It's more and more movies are getting made directly for streaming services. If a streaming service feels that a movie has real Oscar chances, or there's something about it that they feel like might bring in an audience, their calculation is often, all right, if we put this in theaters, we have to spend $30 million on marketing. Can it bring in $60 million so that at least those marketing costs are paid for? What they get out of it at the end of the day is something that is more valuable to the streaming services because people know about that movie because of all the marketing dollars. But that's the calculation they make, which is why a lot of movies are just going directly to streaming services now.
And are there certain genres that are more suited to the streaming services versus theater, or is it script dependent?
I think it's script dependent. For a while, people would say, well, if it's really big budget, it'll be for theaters. Case anymore. A lot of big budget movies are being made for streaming services. I think that's going to change a little bit. The streaming services, as has been widely talked about, have been cutting back on budgets the last couple of years. There was a while where it was not that uncommon to see movies that were with budgets of over $200 million made just for streaming services. I don't think we're going to see as many of those moving forward. That said, they would usually rather make a giant, big star, big budget, big concept movie than they would, a small $5 million movie, which they're doing very little of now. Sometimes they'll buy those things if they can get them cheaply out of a film festival once they're already made, but they're not making many of those anymore, whereas that seemed like more of their business for a while.
And there seems to be more genre bending movies now that seems to be a bit more popular. Are there ways that a screenwriter can effectively approach this? And should they be mindful of what audiences expect from each genre to do this successfully?
Yeah, well, I'm going to answer that a slightly different way than you asked it. Something that I hate to say things like this because there are great movies that don't fall into this, but there's a expression, a feathered fish, which is a movie that can sort of hit more than one genre. It's a romantic comedy, but it's also a science fiction movie. That, for example, those kinds of things can be harder to make because streaming services very often feel like they're harder to market. Again, there are big exceptions to that, but make a romantic comedy, make a sci-fi movie. It's when you sort of merge various genres, and I'm just giving two examples. There are many in there that I know streaming services will sometimes have a tougher time with. Listen, I love musicals. Musicals have been very hard to make the last couple of years. Wicked is coming out very soon. I think Wicked is going to be an enormous hit. Well, part one is coming out very soon. And I'm hoping that will change the appetite for musicals, because it's a genre that I think is completely viable. I think that there were a few musicals that maybe audiences either wanted stars, or they felt like they'd seen an earlier version of it, or just they didn't know what it was. But I think that there is still a real audience for a well-made, entertaining movie musical, and I hope that the success of Wicked will wake studios up to the fact that that's a viable option.
And are there certain structures within genres that you should be following, or with non-linear structures? Does that lend itself to specific genres?
I feel like structure is really up to a writer. If you look at a movie like Memento, which put Chris Nolan on the map, that was one of the most bizarre structures I ever saw. But my God, what a fascinating movie, and gave Chris Nolan an enormous career. So, don't come up with a wild structure for the sake of coming up with a wild structure. It needs to fit the story that you're telling. But I think that's up to a writer to figure out what is the best, most interesting, most evocative way that I can tell the story. Sometimes that's going to be to tell it in a completely linear way, and sometimes it's not.
Is there a way for a writer to avoid a sort of mid-story lull in terms of the structure and pacing? This can often happen in more character-driven scripts. Are there any tips for that a writer can do to check themselves from falling into that sort of slow pacing?
If you're working on a screenplay and you're worried about the pacing, again, as I mentioned earlier, I would give it to a couple of friends, and you can be honest, say, maybe you don't say in advance, but the first thing to ask is, did you feel like there were pacing problems? Were you bored in here? And if they're being very honest with you, they'll give you a good answer. Again, the biggest crime is to bore your audience, and sometimes that's for repeating something. Sometimes that's for most stories have some kind of an engine. Sometimes you kind of get lost in tangents and you kind of forget that engine. I read something the other day where there was it was a TV pilot, and there was a sort of a race that was set up between characters in an office setting. And just after the race was set up, the next scene was a scene where they were all having lunch together. And the writers have said, you've given the story this great engine, and then you sort of turn the engine off, and they all sit around and talk. And so I said, take a look at it. Maybe you want to switch those around so that as soon as they're off and running, they are off and running. Anyway.
No, that's understandable. With a character, what are the things you look for where you think this will definitely attract top talent?
Oh, actors like to show off. You were asking earlier about The Bone Collector. I read that book and I thought, whoa, somebody's going to want to play this role. This is the kind of role that's it's pretty intriguing. When I read the first draft of the screenplay of Milk, the script very much needed some work, but there was a character there that I thought could attract a movie star. As soon as I read it, I made a list of the stars who I thought could get it made, and there were 3. And fortunately, one of them was Sean Penn, and Sean Penn said yes, but it wasn't like there were 15 people that could play that. By the way, an addendum to that, now people are saying, oh, you can only cast a gay person in a gay role, then we wouldn't have gotten that movie made, because even today, there's not a gay movie star that could have gotten that movie financed. Even with Sean Penn, we still needed Emile Hirsch and Diego Luna and James Franco and Josh Brolin to have enough sort of star wattage to get the budget that we needed.
And in terms of budget, are there things that you look out for in a screenplay that you think that will just kill it? Or is it always pretty workable? Are there things, especially as new writers, are there things you need to be looking out for? They'd say a lot of the time with new writers, it's one location, keep it low budget. Is this something you'd recommend for a brand new screenwriter?
You know, I would never limit a writer in that way. If the writer was specifically a writer director and they knew they had $500,000 and they were going to make their own movie, then yes, you want to limit the locations. But if you're a writer who's writing a script that you want to make an impact, then write the script that you want to make, but make sure it fits the story. If you're writing a quiet romantic comedy between two people, then you probably don't want to have a scene at the Super Bowl, because you're not going to be able to shoot the Super Bowl on the budget for that kind of a movie. If you're writing a script about somebody goes to blow up the Super Bowl, then take place the Super Bowl. And you know what? If you're a first-time writer and you write a great script, fantastic. That's the great thing about the movie business. Nobody cares what you've done before if you have a great script. That is what matters, is a great script. I will say in television, it's a different story because TV is an ongoing thing. It's much harder to get a show on TV if you haven't had some experience in TV, or at the very least in movies or theater or something. It's not that it's impossible, but it's very difficult without having some kind of experience, because they want to know that you can be the creative head of something for 30, 40, 50, 60 episodes. And if you don't have any TV experience, it's less likely that a TV network or a streaming service is going to take a gamble on you. In movies, we don't care. A great script is a great script.
I'd love to move on to how you actually go about getting your first screenplay out there. Be it screenplay competitions, be it targeting a certain producer or a certain studio. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Sophie, I wish I could tell you the best way to get your work seen, and there is no perfect route. Screenplay competitions, you know why screenplay competitions can help? Because there are a certain number of managers that will want to read who won this competition or who won that competition, and it can really help you to get representation. Are there executives at Netflix or Paramount or Hulu who are reading all the scripts that come out of this competition or that? Probably not. They have too many scripts on their plate. But if you get a manager, and that manager is somebody who is viable in the business, and the manager believes in you, and the manager could then call the executive at Netflix or Hulu or Amazon or wherever and say, you have got to read the script, it's fantastic, then it's all worthwhile having gone through that road. It's hard to get an agent when you haven't done anything. But if you have other writer friends and you're passing work back and forth, and maybe some of your writer friends have agents, this is not something you do week one of your new writers group, but by, let's say you're 4 or 5 months in, and somebody in your writers group said, wow, your writing has really come a long way, I love where you are, then maybe there's a chance to say, can I ask you a favor? If you're comfortable, would you mind showing this to your manager? Again, nobody wants a relationship that feels completely transactional, but if you know this person is a fan of your writing, that's a very viable thing to do, because if your writing is great, that person's doing their manager a favor by making the introduction. So great. If your writing is not there, then you're going to get oh yeah, my manager doesn't really do that. And that's somebody telling you either, I don't want to help you, or sorry, your stuff's just not good enough yet. But there are a number of managers that will read scripts by newer writers, in which case it's writing that great cover letter that makes the story sound so exciting, so intriguing that they can't say no. I have to share something. I get a lot of emails from people who have never worked in the business, who want me to read their script. And at this moment in time, I'm a one-man shop, so I read everything myself. So I can't do that. I don't have the hours in the day to do that. I spend a huge amount of time reading, but to read unsolicited scripts, there just isn't time to do that. But I read the cover letters. There's somebody who has sent me this cover letter now 3 times, and it says, I sent the script out a few years ago. It wasn't ready, but I've since cut down the characters. It's more focused now. And now I love it. I'm like, why in the world are you telling anybody this? Nobody remembers. Nobody knows who you are. Don't tell me you wrote a bad version of this and now you're sending it to me again. Why would you do any of that? And I kind of want to strangle this guy and say, dude, you need to completely throw this out and come up with a much, much better cover letter, because this is actually embarrassing you and not helping you with your cause. And what you want to do is get your screenplay read.
And with that, with the pitching process, are there things that you personally like to see, be it mood board, vision boards?
You know, I will say, if it's a brand new writer, again, because I don't have the manpower, I'm not going to I just don't have the time to read it. I think it's all about the script, and I do believe that a great cover letter, if you have to put yourself in the manager's shoes. Your manager's shoes, that manager's going to read 8 scripts over the weekend. 4 of them are going to be by their clients, so they have 4 more scripts to read. Why should yours be one of those scripts? And keep that in mind. What can you say in that letter that's going to make that manager believe, it's worth my time to read this person. I can make money from this person. It's a business. They need to know they can make money from you, and that's what they're thinking about. You know, what's interesting is years ago, pitching movies was a viable business for screenwriters, and very few movie pitches are sold anymore. They don't want to do the development. They'll listen to a pitch if you're going in with, Ryan Reynolds and Will Ferrell attached and Sean Levy directing it, that they're going to buy. But if you go in with just a writer with a great pitch for a movie, it's very, very hard to sell those right now. TV, there are still pitches that are sold on a pretty regular basis. That said, in the streaming world, I don't know the percentages, but a lot of what streaming services will buy are scripts with elements attached, as opposed to pitches. But they will still buy a pitch. But again, movies, it's a bummer, because it was a fun process to go out with a great pitch from a movie writer, and now it's just people don't want to hear them.
I think that's quite a good thing for introverted writers, because for me, the art of writing feels quite an introverted action, and then the act of pitching and selling feels like a very extroverted action. The two, to me, don't seem to exist in the same parts of the brain at all. So I was going to ask you what your tips are for an introverted writer to get good at talking about their work, pitching the script, because it is a very different skill.
Well, if you're an introverted writer, you probably shouldn't be selling your script. You should be writing a script and not pitching it. That said, you still have to be able to pitch your script. So figure out how to pitch it in a way that you're comfortable with, and you have to, even if it's hard for you, you have to figure out a way to sell your excitement, your passion, and what how you're going to sell it in a way that's going to make the other person want to read it. But there are certainly writers. I think this is more a network half-hour phenomenon that would pitch so brilliantly, and sometimes they would just be okay writers. To find writers who are great writers and great pitchers, the two don't always go hand in hand. But pitching network half hours was there were more half hours on and there were more pitches being bought, was a real business. And I always felt for the writers that were just not great pitchers.
Oh, so you definitely experienced that. You've come across those writers that are much more head down, do the work.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you're not going to sell a half-hour comedy if you're just head down for the work. Maybe you could write it, but you're not going to sell it as a pitch. But I certainly will work with a writer to try to help them in any way that I can to put their salesman hat on when going out with a TV thing.
I want to speak a little bit on the current state of the industry and how all these streaming platforms and this whole revolution has changed the industry. And has that changed a producer's expectation on screenwriters?
The whole business has changed in the last few years. I think it was 2.5 years ago that where Netflix had been gaining viewers every month for a long period of time, and all of a sudden 2.5 years ago they lost some subscribers, and Wall Street reacted pretty violently in a negative way against that. And that was not only a wake-up call for Netflix, where Wall Street was saying you have to be profitable, where they weren't caring about profit. They were just saying, we're going to keep adding subscribers, we're going to keep spending money, and our stock price is so high, it doesn't matter. And then Wall Street said, no, you need a business model where you're making money, or we're not putting any more money into you. And once that happened at Netflix, virtually overnight, the whole town started saying, okay, this is affecting all of us. We all need to be profitable. So at this moment in time, Netflix actually is profitable, but I'm not sure that any other streaming service is yet profitable, but they're all trying to figure it out. So how that has affected the entire business. That means that they've all laid off people. They're making fewer shows than they used to. The budgets aren't what they were a few years ago. So that just means there are less jobs. There's less niche programming out there. Whereas Amazon a few years ago would have a show like Transparent or Tig Nogaro's show, which were great shows that would win awards, but they had a very small slice of the audience. There's less of that that's going on right now. There are fewer shows that just fit a niche audience. They're all looking for hits. Obviously, if we all knew that magic secret sauce created hits, then the TV would only be made of hits. But they're at least aiming for things to be broad audience based. So that's sort of true everywhere. There is a good side to this. The bad side to it is obvious. There are less jobs. Fewer shows are being sold. That means fewer jobs on those shows. Fewer executives have jobs. So just whole divisions, studios have closed down or have shrunk. And that's bad for everybody. The positive is there was a period a couple of years ago where there was so much television that there were some really good shows that got lost in the shuffle. And the hope is that now that there's going to be a little bit less, it'll be easier for the cream to rise to the top, for audiences to find those great shows that are out there. So, it's always a challenging thing. You can make a great TV series and nobody would watch it. And that was happening with more frequency. So maybe that'll be happening less. So that's the TV streaming world. The feature world, people had started going to movies a little bit less anyway. And then the pandemic happened and people were staying home and they bought these giant TV sets and they put in great sound systems and they kind of got a little bit out of the habit of going to the movies. So it's harder to get them to leave their house to go to see a film. Also, the video game world became so big, and that takes a lot of time away when people used to go to the movies. I love going to the movies. I'm very fortunate. I'm a member of the Motion Picture Academy, so I get everything sent to me. I will still leave my house to go to a movie theater so much more frequently. I love doing it. I'm going to the movies tonight. I can't wait. I love that whole experience. But on the whole, it's harder to get people out of their house to see a movie. And so as a result, just not as many movies are getting made for theaters as there were at one point in time. And that's just bad for all of us.
And do you think because there is so much content now, though, that a movie has to be so much more special to grab someone's attention? Is there the feel for that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Certainly, if it's a movie, but yeah, either for theaters or for streaming, the bar for everything got higher. Everybody is looking for a while. There was a feeling, and I don't know, not every writers felt this way, but there was a feeling that there was such a need for content that studios and streaming services were just eager to buy so much. And now it kind of feels like they're looking for reasons to pass because they've all gotten beaten up over their budgets. They have a bunch of things that they bought before the strikes that are already in development. So it's just, we're at a moment where it's harder to sell things. It will all even out again, but for the moment, that we accept that reality. That said, we need to. I just think that as writers, as producers, just go about what we're doing. We can't let the fact that, oh God, it's hard to sell things. I'm not going to go write my script. I'm not going to try to put this movie together. That's crazy, because good things will get bought, good things will get made, and that's not going to change.
And how important do you think it is for a screenwriter to diversify into maybe directing as well, if they can, or acting? How important do you think that is in general for a writer to be a good writer?
I wouldn't say it's necessarily important to diversify as much as I would say it's important to keep writing. Every once in a while, I'll see a writer who will be working on a script, and then I'll run into them a year later, and they're still talking about working on that same script. And it'll be like, wait, a year has gone by. You should have written 3 scripts and 2 pilots, or whatever. That's probably a lot, but you have to keep writing, and almost every writer gets better and better and better. One of the top screenwriters in the business, somebody who's paid millions of dollars a script, used to have an office down the hall from me at Universal. He told me the first 6 scripts he wrote, he didn't show anybody. They just stayed in a drawer. Those are the scripts that it took him to learn how to do this. Well, boy, did he learn, because now he's super in demand and gets paid giant money. But boy, keep writing, keep writing, keep writing. I will say, write movies and write TV, and really try to learn both, and keep watching. Go to the movies, watch TV, see what other people are doing, see what's done well, see what's not done well, learn from all that.
And how important do you think it is to have nowadays an online presence? Is that something a writer should be looking to do as well? Just because, the industry has changed a lot and social media has now become huge. Is it something that a writer should be looking to do to get themselves out there, or just focus on the writing?
I think focus on the writing. I don't believe that anybody has ever sold a screenplay because they had, 1 million followers on Instagram. I don't believe that's a real thing. I think that there are sometimes writers who believe that is a real thing. I think, boy, all that time you put into getting more followers in social media, maybe if you were working on writing a really fantastic screenplay, that would be the thing that would push you ahead, not the fact that you have all these followers. There's a lot of people who I know who are very active on Twitter and very funny and quippy, etc., and they have absolutely zero writing career, and that's fine, but they're not the two. I don't believe the social media presence really helps your writing.
Okay, that's refreshing to know for me. I like that answer. Thank you. Dan, thank you so much for talking to me. I've really appreciated this. Thank you. Really appreciate the interview.
My pleasure. Fun to do.